This is problem 12-2C. It's from chapter 12. And it gives us a table and tells us that that table depicts the hypothetical economy in which the marginal propensity to save is constant at all levels of real GDP. Investment spending is autonomous and there is no government. So they give us, in this table, they give us real GDP, consumption, saving, and investment. And then they ask us to, or they tell us as well, that the economy's marginal propensity to save is 0.25 and its marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. And they ask us to use the line drawing tool to draw the consumption function using the values of $0 and $10,000 for real GDP to locate the endpoints of the line and label it C. So all we have to do here is draw the line that corresponds to these numbers in consumption. So they tell us to use the endpoints of $0 and $10,000 GDP. So we'll graph the line between the point at 0 GDP and 500 consumption and the point at 10,000 GDP and 8,000 consumption. So let's click our little magnifying glass, bring it up, and I'll move it over so I can see the table. Click my line, and I know that at 0, so the horizontal axis is GDP per year and the vertical axis is planned real consumption and investment. So I know that at $0 of GDP, the table tells me I have 500 in consumption. So I'm going to graph the point 0 and 500, or since this, notice that the axis is labeled in thousands, so 500 really just means 0.5 thousand, right? So half a thousand. And then at 10,000, I know from the table that I have 8,000 in consumption. So I'm going to go over to the 10 in GDP and up to the 8 in consumption. And notice in the upper right-hand corner of the graph, you can see the point. It actually tells you that I'm at 10,8, so I can be sure that I'm in the right place here before I click. And now I want to label this my consumption line, C. The second thing it asks us to do over here is to use the line drawing tool to add the investment function to obtain C plus I. So remember that aggregate demand includes both consumption and investment, so it really helps us to be able to graph both. So now all I want to do is I want to add the investment column to figure out where my points are. So at a GDP of 0, I know I have consumption of 500 and investment of 1,500. So C plus I is going to be 2,000. So I'm going to go to GDP of 0 and C plus I of 2,000. So I'm going to go up to the 2. And likewise for my 10,000 GDP, I have 8,000 in consumption and 1,500 in investment. So I'm going to go up to 9.5 to get my consumption plus investment. So I'm going to go to a GDP of 10, and I'm going to look again up in the right-hand corner to make sure I'm in the right place. I want the point 10, 9.5. There we go. And I can click that, and I want to label that C plus I, because that's now my consumption plus investment. And save that and check our answer. And we did well. Good. So now the second part of it asks us to look at the graph and figure out the equilibrium level of real GDP. And you'll remember from reading this in your textbook that the equilibrium level of GDP is just the place where consumption plus investment equals GDP. And on the graph we can see this from, they have drawn in here this line that splits us in half, the 45-degree line on the graph. And that line tells us where GDP equals C plus I. So I just want to go to my C plus I line and see where it crosses that 45-degree line, which I see is up here somewhere around 8,000 GDP. But I can check that by looking at the table and make sure that at 8,000 I've got C plus I also equal to 8,000. So I've got 6,500 plus 1,500, and yes, that does equal 8,000. So at a real GDP of 8,000 is where my consumption plus investment equals my GDP, which is where we consider to have our GDP equilibrium. So it's at $8,000. And that's just our equilibrium rule for GDP, just like we have equilibrium rule for supply and demand or anything else that we've studied. We have our equilibrium rules. And for GDP, the equilibrium rule is just that it's wherever GDP equals C plus I. The last part asks us for this economy's numerical value of the multiplier. So the multiplier is the number you have to multiply by the change in C plus I in order to figure out the resulting change in GDP. So whenever consumption and investment change in the economy, the GDP also changes. And the question is by how much? So this multiplier will tell us that. So we can look at the change in C plus I. We can multiply it by the multiplier, and that will tell us how much the GDP has also changed. And conveniently, we have a formula for this multiplier, and that formula is just that it's 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. And we're already told in this equation, or this question, we're already told the marginal propensity to save is 0.25. So 1 over 0.25, we can ask our calculator for that. Let me clear out what I was doing before. So I can ask my calculator 1 divided by 0.25, and I find out that that's 4. So the multiplier for this economy is 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, which in this case is 1 over 0.25, which is 4. And we're good. So let me know if you have any more questions about this, and I'll be happy to help.